Okay, so for this next section, now that we've talked a little bit about the God of Israel and iconography related to the God of Israel, I want to turn to a different topic, one that isn't discussed a whole lot within the context of biblical studies, at least on a more, let's say, like everyday basis or for the everyday reader. And that has to do with the notion of God's wife. Um, so let me provide a little bit of background for this conversation because it is probably something that you might not be so familiar with. But within the context of ancient Near Eastern studies, it's widely recognized that all major deities at some point during their sort of historical lifetime also had a wife or a consort or some sort of female companion who served as their sort of second in command, or even in some cases an equal sort of governor of the universe. And these are usually goddesses. And the question is, to what extent the God of ancient Israel also had a female goddess accompany him within the mythological realm. So we'll move into that discussion because this is something that scholars are talking about, and there's a lot of ancient Near Eastern iconography that relates to this concept, though it's not as widely recognized within the Bible itself. So let's first start by talking about goddesses in the ancient Near East. So, as I said, goddesses are found throughout the ancient Near East, and they're ubiquitously worshipped in all sorts of communities. And in some communities, the primary deity is actually a goddess rather than a male deity. But oftentimes, goddesses serve as the wife of a deity. This is the case for many gods in antiquity. Usually they're independent agents, so they still do their own sort of thing, but the divine couple, so to speak, exists as a group of governing deities. Sometimes the female deity is associated with the creation of the world, or the creation of humanity, or the creation of the gods. This is true in Ugarit, for example, with the goddess Asherah. She, in that context, is known as the mother of the gods. And this is true in other cases in Mesopotamia and in Egypt as well. These goddesses often have their own mythological traditions that are associated with them. Isis, for example, in Egypt has a robust mythological tradition associated with her, stories that are told about her specifically, and this is true in Mesopotamia as well. The goddess Ishtar or the Sumerian deity Inanna they both have mythological stories associated with them. There's a lovely story called The Descent of Ishtar or Inanna, that is widely available, and I recommend reading it because it's a lovely myth about the goddess Ishtar going into the underworld. And I won't spoil anything for you, but it's a lovely little story. But some major goddesses that we can talk about are not only Ishtar and Isis, but also Asherah, as I mentioned, a goddess of Ugarit, and another goddess known as Anat, who comes from that area, both of which show up in the Hebrew Bible, though in different sorts of ways, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. There's the Egyptian deity Hathor, who's also incredibly important within the ancient Near East. And she's widely worshipped, not only in Egypt, but outside of Egypt. We have iconography of Hathor, for example, from the land of Israel. So she was also worshipped there. And then within the context of Anatolia, there's a well-known goddess who's called the sun goddess of Arena, which is the capital city of the Hittite Empire. And she is widely venerated in Turkey and in Syria, for that matter. The question is, did the God of Israel actually have a consort or a wife in history? So there are a number of scholars who have proposed these ideas, and this has a lot to do with textual and iconographic evidence. So, for example, in William Deaver's book, Did God Have a Wife? Archaeology and Folk Religion in Ancient Israel, Deaver makes the claim very forcefully that in ancient Israel, despite what the Hebrew Bible has to say, many people thought that there was a goddess who lived alongside the God of Israel. She was worshipped as his wife, and she did her own sorts of things. So if you think back, let me scroll up and grab the slide here. But remember when we were looking at the temple in Arad, one of the interesting things about this temple niche in Arad is that we have multiple altars in existence in this temple niche, which may suggest that another deity besides the God of Israel was worshipped here. And this is just one case in which we have a sacrificial or cultic system that may be set up to worship more than one deity. And this is really important because this is in ancient Judah, and so many scholars believe that the temple in Arad was not only dedicated to the God of Israel, but to his wife, perhaps Asherah or someone like that. But at least from a historical perspective, the notion that ancient Israelites worshipped a goddess alongside the God of Israel would be consistent with what we found throughout the ancient Near East. It would actually be more surprising if it was the case that no goddess was worshipped at all. And this is obviously not the case because within ancient Israel and Judah, we have many, many goddesses that are attested in the iconography. Now, you might say, well, of course, we know that they were worshiping goddesses alongside the God of Israel, but these are forbidden. And we'll talk about that in just a second, what that might mean. But the point is, at least from a popular level, from people just living in ancient Israel, they're probably worshiping a goddess alongside the God of Israel. If you're more interested in iconography related to the goddesses in the ancient Near East, I highly recommend Isaac Cornelius's book, The Many Faces of the Goddess. This is a wonderful book that catalogs many, 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 many images associated with the goddess in and around Syria, Palestine in particular. But he does touch on deities throughout the Near East in the book. So highly recommend that study. But let's turn to the Hebrew Bible to talk about the evidence that exists there. So as the Hebrew Bible, as you know, the Hebrew Bible presents the God of Israel as the primary deity of ancient Israel. But we do have other deities that surface, if only by name. So we've already talked about Baal showing up in the story of Elijah. The story only makes sense if the deity Baal at least was thought to exist and to be active. And so that story sort of highlights the fact that we do have belief in other deities, not only by the people living in ancient Israel, but by the biblical writers themselves. So many arguments have been made for the existence, or at least the reference to various goddesses in the Hebrew Bible. So I'll give you the first one here is the goddess Asherah. She shows up, her name shows up in a variety of different places, but usually in the context of forbidden cult objects. So in the Bible, rather than refer to Asherah as a goddess, it refers to Asherah as a sacred pole of some kind, probably wooden. It can be burned and cut down, so it seems like it's made of wood. And in some cases, this is exactly what the biblical writers tell us, that it's constructed of a tree. Incidentally, actually, in ancient Israel or in the ancient Levant, the goddess is very closely associated with the tree, or like the cosmic tree, and her imagery that we'll see in a moment is associated with arboreal imagery as well. But usually when Asherah does show up, as I said, she shows up in the context of being a forbidden cult object. You shall not erect an Asherah in the temple of the God of Israel, for example. This is the line that Deuteronomy in the Book of Kings takes. It's actually so forbidden that it becomes a mode of evaluating quote unquote bad kings within 1 and 2 Kings. So in those stories, a king of Israel does what is evil in the eyes of the Lord, as the text tells us, because maybe they set up an Asherah pole in a temple or in some sort of place of worship. And so they've actually disobeyed biblical law, at least insofar as Deuteronomy and Exodus are concerned. They're pretty clear that you're not supposed to do this. But the fact that you can do it, and the fact that they keep saying don't do it, means that probably a lot of people were, despite the fact that there were prohibitions, at least on the Bible's part, against doing such a thing. In the book of Jeremiah, we also get this interesting cryptic reference to a quote unquote goddess known as the Queen of Heaven. In the Queen of Heaven, there's a ton of scholarship on who this Queen of Heaven might be. Some people say that it's Asherah. Some people say that it's Anat. Other arguments include that the goddess is Mesopotamian Ishtar, or another West Semitic goddess known as Astarte. Who it doesn't really matter who this goddess is. What Jeremiah tells us is that people are baking cakes for the Queen of Heaven, particularly women. So even during the time of when Jeremiah is writing in the 6th century, we have prophets who are telling us there are people in the land of Israel who are dedicating offerings to a god other than the God of Israel, and in this case, it's a goddess. So what that means is even if the Bible is prohibiting the worship of a goddess, the prohibition itself tells us something important. It tells us that people were probably worshiping a deity or a goddess, and that this goddess is probably identifiable in iconography, at least in the form of a cult object, but in other forms as well. And we'll look at some of those. So one of the main features of the goddess in especially the Levant is the sacred tree. So goddesses are frequently identified with trees in iconography. I've given you an example that I think is really nice because it sort of shows the personification of the tree with the goddess. So this ivory over here is also housed in the Louvre, and it dates to the Late Bronze Age. And this ivory depicts a goddess in the center. And notice she's holding these little branches here. These are probably young budding branches, which these caprids, probably like deer or something like that, are jumping up to feed upon. So if you've ever seen actually in spring, you'll see this in the wild where animals like deer and things like that will sort of stand against a tree and eat the young budlings of the plant as food. And in this image, it seems like what's happening is the goddess is sort of represented anthropomorphically, but she's holding the tree limbs and feeding these wild animals. So we have sort of a blending of the sacred tree idea with a personified or anthropomorphic representation of the deity. So within the Bible, we actually see images that are, we read about images that are associated with this idea, though they are reserved in talking about the goddess. So in the Bible, we have a number of cases where sacred trees show up. So at least the reminiscence of goddess imagery. So in the Genesis stories, particularly with Abraham, we have divine theophanies show up in groves of trees. And we read about the oak of Mamre, a relatively famous tree within the patriarchal cycle that serves as a site of theophany and divine revelation. And some scholars go so far as to argue that these stories go back to a time when they were told about a goddess rather than the God of Israel, because they're involving the main symbol of the goddess, possibly. But in either case, what we have is sort of a blending. People who work on this sort of stuff say, in the same way that the God of Israel absorbed depictions of, say, the sun god or the storm god or the god of the mountains or the divine warrior from other deities or other ideological systems in the Near East. They also say things like, well, when the God of Israel was promoted as the only God in all of the universe, he's the only one. Well, he had to also absorb ideology associated with the goddess. You can't just take on all of the male characteristics, but you have to take on the feminine ones as well. And one of the things that they say is that this imagery of the sacred tree in these stories comes from the realm of the goddess and now has been ascribed to the God of Israel. So that may also be the case in Ezekiel's vision of the cosmic tree in Ezekiel 31. This is a wonderful image of a blossoming tree that covers the whole earth, and its canopy serves as protection and offers food and shelter for all who live on earth. And the same is true in Daniel 4 with another description of a sacred tree as well, a cosmic sacred tree. Cosmic in the sense that it's this sort of like primordial, ancient, large, massive tree that goes back to the beginning of time. And you can even think about stories that involve sacred trees and sacred gardens. For example, the Garden of Eden. So in that story, again, we have tree imagery that is closely associated with an early myth in ancient Israel. And in that story, of course, the tree is quite, or the trees are quite important. And so there we also have some sort of overlap with ancient Near Eastern thinking about the goddess. But as I said, in the book of Deuteronomy, we read often, and Kings for that matter, we read a lot about people who worship under every green tree. And this is a prohibited activity, even though this is exactly what happens to Abraham. So apparently he didn't read Deuteronomy. But in Deuteronomy, you're not supposed to worship under green trees or on every high hill, as they tell us. But this seems to be a cryptic reference to saying, don't worship any goddesses. This is not what you're supposed to do. At least this is the line that the writers of Deuteronomy in the book of Kings takes, and some of the prophets as well, Jeremiah most notably. But in all cases, especially in the West Semitic world, the world from which our Bible comes, trees are frequently associated with female deities. And so when we read about these sacred trees, when we read about encounters with the divine in a space that is much more associated with like a garden or a forest, we're getting very close to goddess mythology. And so this imagery that we find in the iconography actually helps us understand how the biblical writers have sort of adopted ancient Near Eastern ways of thinking and incorporated them into their ideas about their God. So like I said, in this case, goddess imagery and goddess ideas are sort of transplanted onto the God of Israel and in the Hebrew Bible.
What Bible do you read? And how do you know it's the right one?
There's only one version of the Bible, right?
It might surprise you to learn that Bible translations led to many versions of Holy Scripture. Long ago, translators interpreted the Hebrew Bible, ensuring it would be enjoyed in many languages. But when they encountered Hebrew words they didn't understand, translators relied on their individual cultural context and used different words with different meanings unrelated to the original ones. This led to Bible versions that lacked the full, beautiful, original explanations becoming part of our history. That's why when you join our online classes, you'll get back to the source of the original Hebrew Bible to uncover hidden meanings.
Get back to the source. Join our online course today, where the treasures of the authentic Bible await you.
Click on the link and register to start your biblical experience.